refuses to leave his father's chest, but when the doctor discovered the reason, he immediately called the police. Both Dan and Anna had always had the desire to start a family of their own. They were happy the moment their son Alex was born into the world. He had an inquisitive temperament and a quirky habit that quickly became the topic of conversation in their home. He was a beautifully healthy baby who was also quite gorgeous. Since the time Alex was able to cling to his father, he has been adamant about being on Don's chest. The initial reaction of Dan and Anna was one of endearment. Anna would exclaim with a grin, "He just loves his daddy," as she saw Alex nuzzling against Don's chest when he was sleeping or while he was being carried about the home. On the other hand, Alex's conduct became increasingly severe as the weeks progressed into months. While Dan was not holding him close, he would wail hysterically, and he appeared to have an almost magnetic pull to his father's chest. Even while Dan was holding him, he would cry. The predilection was more than simply a preference. It was an addiction. Dan and Anna started to feel concerned. Was this a typical occurrence? Could there have been a problem with Alex? Is it possible that Dan was suffering from a mental illness? They went to see their physician, Dr. Patel, since they were concerned about something. In the beginning, Dr. Patel listened with patience, thinking that it was no more than a passing phase or a peculiar connection. However, when Dan continued to describe how Alex would put his small ear against his chest, almost as if he were listening to something, the doctor's demeanor changed. A momentary glimmer of concern could be seen in his eyes. It was a hesitancy that caused Dan and Anna to exchange anxious looks with one another. "Dan," Dr. Patel said in a hesitant voice, "I need you to come to the hospital for some tests." Instantaneously, they felt a shiver run down their spines as a result of the intensity. In his words, Dan made an attempt to dismiss it by saying that perhaps Alex simply liked the sound of his heartbeat when he first heard it. Nevertheless, Dr. Patel did not laugh. The expression on his face was solemn, and he ordered that they go immediately. A battery of examinations, including blood testing, X-rays, and an MRI, were performed on Dan while he was at the hospital. During the anxious wait in the corridor, Anna rocked Alex in her arms as she waited. As if he knew something that the grown-ups did not, the infant exhibited an exceptionally serene demeanor. The appearance of Dr. Patel's face was pale when the findings were returned. A second specialist was brought in, and then a third one was brought in. As the room became filled with murmurs and quiet tones, Dan could actually feel his heart hammering in his chest across the whole room. At long last, Dr. Patel turned his attention to Dan and Anna, his voice shaking slightly. "There's something that's going on inside of your chest, Dan. Something that is not natural." An uneasy laugh came from Dan. "What exactly do you mean? That's something?" Similar to a tumor, the head of Dr. Patel was shaken. "It is not. It's not a tumor. Simply put, it is a gadget. An intricately designed and compact piece of technology that is implanted close to your heart. Possibly ever when you were a young child. It has been there for many years. Alex is the only one who can hear the frequency that it is transmitting, which is a sound or a vibration. It is for this reason why he is so connected to your chest. It is something that he is drawn to." After being taken aback, Dan and Anna glanced at him. "What kind of device?" Her voice was scarcely audible above a whisper when Anna inquired. After a moment of hesitation, Dr. Patel finally stated, "I've never seen anything like it. In no way is it medical. It is quite similar to a tracking gadget, but it is far more advanced. To add insult to injury, it has been sending data somewhere." There was complete silence in the room. Dan had a chilly sweat that began to form on his forehead. He reflected on his upbringing, recalling the hazy recollections of a vehicle accident that occurred when he was 6 years old and the weeks that he had spent in the hospital recuperating from the tragedy. At that time, had something taken place? Were they the ones who inserted this inside him? Dr. Patel snatched up the phone and dialed a number before anybody else could make a sound. We want to make a call to the police, also the Federal Bureau of Investigation. To put it simply, this is unlike anything I've ever experienced. The moment the authorities came, Don's thoughts began to race. Who was responsible for all of this? And for what reason? Did he face any danger? Were they his family? With his small hands reaching out for Don's chest once again, Alex started crying as he became aware of the tension across the room. With tears flowing down her cheeks, Anna clasped him tightly in her arms. A network of secrets that Dan could never have anticipated was revealed as a result of the inquiry that continued after it. There was a connection between the gadget that was implanted in his chest and a mysterious organization that had been doing experiments on children 30 years ago, implanting technology in them for purposes that are still unclear. The memories of Dan, who had been one of those youngsters, had been repressed and his life had been closely monitored from a distance. As the facts became more apparent, Dan came to the realization that Alex's fixation on his chest was not only a peculiarity. Rather, it was a means of survival. Through some means, the infant had picked up on the threat, the secret reality that was concealed within his father. Not only did Dan and Anna have to struggle for answers, but they also had to fight for their lives since the police were engaged and the group was trying to conceal their tracks from the investigation. All of them were spared in the end because to Alex's peculiar actions. There was a link between the father and the boy that refused to be explained. It was a tie that was more profound than anybody could have ever comprehended. And while Dan clung to Alex, feeling the steady beat of his own heart, he made a solemn commitment to shield his family from the shadows of his past, whatever of the consequences. The presence of the police at the hospital, which came within minutes, contributed to the mounting anxiety that was already present. Both Dan and Anna were questioned individually by the detectives as they attempted to put together Don's history. Dan had a hard time recalling anything that was out of the ordinary. Nevertheless, the more he thought about it, the more fragmented his memories were. He recalled blurry pictures of white jackets, bright lights, and a voice telling him, "This will only hurt for a moment." During this time, scientists were working to examine the gadget that was located in Don's chest. It wasn't your typical tracker at all. The technology was decades ahead of anything that was available for commercial use, and the components with which it was equipped were nearly foreign in their level of intricacy. Additionally, the gadget had been transferring data to an unidentified place for more than 3 decades, and it was self-sustaining, meaning that it was fueled by Don's own body heat and heartbeat. It was determined that Dan and Anna needed to be placed into protective care. The inquiry progressed. After the authorities discovered that their secret had been revealed, they were concerned that the person who had installed the device may attempt to quiet Dan. Inexplicably, Alex continued to be pulled to Don's chest, and he eventually became the family's anchor. It appeared as though he was attempting to protect his father from danger by placing his little hands on the superficial scar that was located where the gadget was located. As the days progressed into weeks, the Federal Bureau of Investigation took over the investigation. A series of occurrences that were quite similar to this one were discovered by them. These incidents featured youngsters who had vanished or been engaged in accidents many years earlier, only to re-emerge with no recollection of what had occurred. A significant number of these youngsters, who were now adults, had passed away under unclear circumstances. Dan was one of the few people who had managed to live, and he was the only one whose implant had successfully been found, operating beneath many layers of phony names and shell corporations. The group that was responsible for the tests was difficult to identify. They were doing long-term research on human behavior, and the FBI felt that they were utilizing the implanted devices to remotely monitor their participants. Their motivations were unknown, but the FBI suspected that they were doing this. Some of the operatives put out the hypothesis that the organization was getting ready to carry out something far more nefarious, such as a worldwide monitoring network or even operations involving mind control. While Dan was a critical witness, he was also a target for the investigation. When he awakened one night, he was residing in a secure home, and the sound of smashing glass was disturbing him. A masked burglar had managed to get past the security personnel while carrying a syringe that contained a poisonous substance. During the course of his defense of Alex and Anna, Dan fought back, his instincts taking over. A disturbing fact was revealed by the invader before he was restrained, and it was as follows: you were never supposed to remember. They never intended for you to be aware of it. At the same time as the threat became more severe, Dan and Anna started to become aware of something special about Alex. The baby's fixation on Don's chest was not only due to the gadget. Rather, it seemed as if Alex had the ability to perceive things that other people were unable to. He would weep just before the phone rang, or he would chuckle when Dan was feeling particularly concerned, as if he was trying to console him. However, the findings of the tests that the doctors performed on Alex were inconclusive. However, despite the fact that he was in wonderful health, there was something odd about him. The possibility that Alex may have inherited some of the effects of the gadget is one notion that has surfaced. Over the course of several decades, the technology that was implanted in Don's chest had been interacting with his body, causing minor changes to his DNA. As a result of those alterations being handed down to Alex at the time of his conception, he possesses enhanced senses and maybe even a type of intuition. The theory was completely out of the ordinary, but it did explain why Alex was so sensitive to the frequency of the gadget. An abandoned facility located deep within the mountains was finally located by the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI). In spite of the dangers, Dan was adamant on participating in the raid. It was not only for himself that he required answers, but also for Alex. It was a complex maze of frigid, sterile chambers that were crammed with obsolete apparatus and documentation that detailed studies that had been conducted over the course of several decades. When Dan looked through the files, he discovered his own name and a picture of himself when he was a youngster. His greatest fears were realized when he obtained the documents, which revealed that he had been selected for the program due to his one-of-a-kind genetic composition, which made him a perfect candidate for the implant. The crew found a large server that was still streaming data when they were in the control room of the infrastructure. Through the use of the implants, the group had been monitoring hundreds of participants all around the world in order to get information on a wide range of topics, including brain activity and emotional reactions. On the other hand, the most alarming revelation was a live stream that showed additional children. These youngsters, like Alex, appeared to have inherited powers from their implanted parents. Before the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI could remove the server from service, a squad of armed agents attacked the site. After a ferocious battle broke out, Dan found himself in direct confrontation with the one who had been responsible for the experiments. This individual was a chilly and calculating figure who was only referred to as the director. Dan was referred to as a failed experiment by the guy, who also asserted that Alex was the future, a new generation of upgraded people. Dan was ejected from the conversation. Dan came back with a fight, propelled by his anger and his desperation. In the midst of the mayhem, the facility started to fall apart, with its systems being overwhelmed as a result of the FBI's efforts to shut it down. Don was successful in evading capture while carrying vital information, but the director disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a disturbing message that read, "This isn't over." Following the destruction of the building and the disruption of the organization's activities, Dan and Anna were finally able to experience a feeling of relief. Dan was able to securely remove the device that was implanted in his chest, and the information that he obtained assisted the FBI in locating and rescuing additional individuals. Alex, who was no longer under the effect of the gadget, started acting like a typical infant, despite the fact that Dan and Anna were aware that he would always be considered special. Dan couldn't escape the notion that the director was still out there, watching and waiting for them while they rebuilt their lives. He couldn't convince himself otherwise. However, for the time being, he concentrated on the things that were most important to him. his family. While Dan was holding Alex in his arms, he came to the realization that his son's peculiar behavior had been a blessing, a warning that had prevented them all from being hurt. While he gazed into Alex's bright and inquisitive eyes, he was aware that they would face whatever the future had in store for them together, regardless of what it was.